The first thing Robert Lashbrook did was not call the police.
It was 2:30 in the morning, November 28th, 1953, and a man had just gone through a 13th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York City. The body was on the sidewalk below. The room was quiet, and the CIA operative standing inside it picked up the phone and dialed his supervisor's home number. The police were called later by someone else. That single decision, who Lashbrook called first and who he didn't, is the thread that unravels everything, because the official story was simple. A troubled government employee under psychiatric care had taken his own life. Case closed, grief accepted, condolences extended, and for 22 years, that was the only version anyone was allowed to hear. His name was Frank Olson, and the government that employed him had a very specific reason to want his story to end exactly where it did. Frank Olson was not a dissident. He was not a whistleblower. He was not someone who set out to challenge the system from the outside. He was the system, a senior biochemist at Camp Detrick, Maryland, the United States Army's primary biological weapons research facility. Olson held top-secret clearance and direct operational knowledge of some of the most classified programs the CIA had ever run. He believed in the work. He believed in the mission. In the early years of the Cold War, when the Soviet threat felt immediate and the stakes felt existential, Frank Olson was exactly the kind of man the government needed: skilled, loyal, and unquestioning.
That loyalty was not an accident. It was cultivated. Camp Detrick in the late 1940s and early 1950s was not simply a research facility. It was the institutional center of a classified effort to understand whether the human mind could be chemically controlled, chemically broken, and chemically rebuilt. The program had a name that would eventually become infamous: MKUltra, and Frank Olson was cleared to know things about it that most Americans would not learn for another 2 decades. In the spring of 1953, Olson traveled to Europe on a classified assignment. The specific nature of what he witnessed there has never been fully declassified. What is documented is what happened when he came home. Colleagues noticed it, his wife noticed it. The man who returned from that trip was not the same man who had left. Something had shifted, quietly, permanently, and in a direction no one around him could fully explain. By November of that year, the shift had become a fracture. On the evening of November 19, 1953, a group of CIA scientists and researchers gathered at a retreat cabin in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. It was a working meeting, informal in structure, and Frank Olson was among those present. What he did not know, what none of them knew, was that Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA chemist directing MKUltra, had made a decision. He would test lysergic acid diethylamide on the group without their knowledge or consent. The substance was added to a bottle of Cointreau after dinner. The following morning, Gottlieb told them what he had done. He framed it as an experiment, a necessary test of a promising tool. Frank Olson's response was not anger, it was not outrage, it was withdrawal. A man already carrying something he could not put down had just been chemically destabilized by the organization he had trusted with his career, his clearance, and his silence. He did not fight back. He went quiet in a way that frightened the people around him. What happened in the days that followed was not a mental health response. It was an institutional one. The CIA did not send Frank Olson home to recover. They did not refer him to an independent physician. They assigned Robert Lashbrook to stay close to him, monitoring his condition, and arranged for him to be seen by a psychiatrist named Harold Abramson. Abramson held a CIA contract. He had his own documented involvement in MKUltra research. The organization that had fractured Frank Olson had now placed his care entirely within its own closed circuit. A man in crisis, surrounded by the same institution managing the consequences of that crisis. There is a word for that arrangement. It is not treatment. By late November, the decision was made to bring Olson to New York. Lashbrook checked them into the Hotel Statler on November 25th. Over the following days, by Lashbrook's own account, Olson appeared to stabilize. He seemed calmer. On the evening of November 27th, Lashbrook reported, Frank went to bed without incident. At 2:30 in the morning, the window gave way. Armand Pastore was the night manager on duty at the Hotel Statler. He reached the scene within minutes of Olson's body hitting the pavement. What he documented in the years that followed contradicts the CIA's account in ways that were never formally resolved. The timeline of events inside the room, the physical condition of the window, the behavior of the man left standing in that room, none of it aligned cleanly with the story the government would tell. Pastore spoke about what he saw. Nobody with the authority to act on it was listening. For 22 years, Frank Olson was a suicide, a statistic, a closed file. Then, in 1975, a presidential commission investigating CIA domestic activities stumbled across his name in classified records. The Rockefeller Commission had not been looking for Frank Olson, but what they found was impossible to quietly rebury. A government employee secretly dosed with a hallucinogenic drug without his consent, dead 9 days later. The commission disclosed the outline of the case. The story reached the press. And suddenly, the government that had spent 2 decades managing Frank Olson's death had a different problem. His family was still alive, and they were owed an explanation. President Gerald Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. He apologized personally. It was a gesture of institutional accountability, measured and choreographed. What it was not was the truth. Internal White House memoranda, later declassified and reported by the New York Times, documented the behind-the-scenes calculation. Dick Cheney, then serving as Ford's chief of staff, was among those involved in managing the legal settlement strategy. The goal, the documents showed, was to resolve the family's claim in a way that prevented full disclosure of the classified programs underlying Frank's death. The family received compensation. They received an apology. They did not receive an answer. The answer, it turned out, was still in the ground. In 1994, Eric Olson, Frank's son, then in his 50s, who had spent his adult life trying to understand what had happened to his father, authorized a full forensic exhumation of the body. The examination was conducted by James Starrs, a forensic scientist from George Washington University with a documented record of serious investigative work. What Starrs found was not ambiguous. There was a hematoma on Frank Olson's skull. Its location and characteristics were inconsistent with the impact of a 13-story fall. They were consistent, Starrs concluded in his published findings, with a blow delivered before the fall. Starrs' conclusion, formally published in the scientific record, was homicide, not suicide, not accident. A blow to the head, delivered in a room with one witness, followed by a fall through a 13th floor window, followed by a phone call to a CIA supervisor before anyone called for help. The New York District Attorney reopened the case in 1999. Investigators began reviewing the evidence. Then, in March of that same year, Sidney Gottlieb died at his home in Virginia. He was 76 years old. He had been the one man alive who held the operational knowledge of what had been decided about Frank Olson in November of 1953. He had never been charged with anything. He had never testified under oath about Deep Creek Lake. He had retired from the CIA in 1973, destroyed his MKUltra files before congressional investigators could subpoena them, and spent his final years, by various accounts, growing organic vegetables and doing volunteer work. The case was never prosecuted. Eric Olson has said publicly, on the record, for decades, that he does not believe his father jumped. He does not believe his father fell. He believes his father was murdered by the organization that employed him, by men who calculated that a destabilized scientist with top-secret knowledge and a fracturing conscience was a liability that needed to be resolved. And the forensic record, the phone records, the documented contradictions in Lashbrook's account, and the behavior of every government official who touched this case across 5 decades. None of it has ever produced a formal answer. What the government built at Camp Detrick in those years, the programs, the experiments, the quiet institutional belief that some people's bodies and minds were acceptable costs, outlasted every investigation, every commission, every apology, and every reopened file. Frank Olson knew what it was. He helped build it. And then one night in New York, in a room with one witness and an open window, he became part of it. The window is still there. The question never left with him.